We're going to be talking about the table saw today. We want basic safety and operation of the table saw. The main thing about operating any power tool is that you need your full attention and focus on the tool and on the work when you're working. You can see here on the table saw, I've got a couple of basic pieces of safety equipment. I got my safety glasses that I always want to be wearing when I'm operating any power tool. So I'm going to put my glasses on. They're wraparound glasses, they're comfortable, they're not going to fall off if I bend over. I've also got a dust mask that you'd probably want to be wearing if you're doing any operations that generate a lot of dust. Okay? I'm going to leave it off for now so you can hear me talking. And we're going to go right into some basic demonstration cuts on the table saw. Now the table saw was designed primarily for ripping. And by ripping I mean that we're cutting down the length of a piece of wood. So if we have a small piece of wood, okay, the length of the piece of wood, we're going to be ripping down the length of the piece of wood. I'm going to be using some bigger pieces for demonstration, and we'll see what happens here. Now, we've got a fence, we've got a table, and we've got a blade. Okay, that's why they call it a table saw. It's got a table saw blade. Whenever we're working on the table saw, we got to keep in mind that this is a 5 horsepower machine and that the blade is spinning at supersonic speed. It's got little carbide tips on the edges of the blade. If one of those came loose and came at you, it'd be like getting shot with a bullet. The other danger with a table saw is kickback. That's where a piece of wood gets caught in the blade and it gets fired out at high speed. So we always want to keep our body out of the line of fire. That means I'm going to keep my body to the left of the blade whenever possible while I'm working on the saw. My arm is going to have to cross on the other side of the blade, but at least it's a small portion, it's a small target. So like I said, operating any tool safely requires your full focus and attention. Now I'm just going to walk through a couple of basic cuts, and I want you to pay real close attention. Okay, the first thing you got to do is put on your safety glasses, which we've already done. And make sure that you have a push stick handy. Okay, we like to use this kind of push stick here. It's got rounded edges. If it comes back at you, it's not going to poke a hole in you because it's got nice rounded edges. And then it's got a heel substantial enough to hook onto the workpiece as you're pushing it through the saw. So the next thing you're going to want to do is set the blade height. Okay, so I've got a piece of 1/2 inch material here. I'm going to set it next to the blade, and I'd like the blade to project no more than 1/4 inch above the workpiece. So I can adjust the height of the blade. Got the hand wheel down here. We'll show you that later. Okay, it's down below the level of the workpiece. I bring it up about 1/16 to 1/4. Okay, 1/8 inch, 1/4 inch. And I want to make sure the workpiece isn't anywhere near the blade when I start cutting. The next thing I'm going to do is set the rip fence to the desired width of cut. Say I want a 3-inch rip out of this board. So I'm going to set the fence for 3 inches. Okay, lightly set the fence and then check with my tape measure between the inside of the tooth and the inside of the fence. When I see I've got 3 inches exactly for accuracy, then I lock the fence down with a little more pressure. So when I get ready to make the cut, okay, I want to check the floor to make sure there's nothing I'm going to trip on. No pieces of wood, no sawdust I can slip on, no sawhorses behind me, nothing that if I step back I'm going to fall over, or if I step forward I'm going to trip and fall into the blade. I also want to make sure that there's nobody walking behind me in case there is a kickback. I'm not going to stab them with a piece of wood. Now you'll notice we don't have a guard on this saw. Usually you want to use the guard on the saw to protect yourself from material flying out. But we removed it so you can see what we're doing here. Also, when you're taking small rips, you can't get your push stick in behind the saw guard, so sometimes we'll remove it for that purpose. But 99% of safety is focus and attention, so you always want to pay attention to what you're doing, where your hands are, where your material is in relationship to the blade, and especially where it is in relationship to the fence and the table. You want to keep in mind that you're always keeping your work down against the table and up against the fence. If it comes away from the fence, then you can suffer a kickback. We're going to turn the saw on. Okay. I check the floor, make sure nobody's walking behind me, and I make sure that my workpiece is nowhere near the blade when I turn the saw on, so that it doesn't come back at me when I turn the saw on. So I take my workpiece. If it's a long one, I'm going to have to walk it into the saw. If it's a short one, I can start the cut with my hips up against the fence. Okay, so my workpiece is here, my push stick is here. I balance the workpiece in both hands. I've got full control of it. If it's any longer, which I'll show you in a little while, we're going to have to start farther back. Okay? So we approach the saw, we make sure we're up against the fence completely, no gaps, down against the table. So with my left hand, I'm pushing against the fence and down against the table. My right hand, I'm controlling the attitude of the workpiece. So now I'm going to start to cut. I walk up to the saw. My left hand doesn't move forward. Just my fingers walk the edge of the piece. When my right hand contacts the saw, the back of the table saw, I hold with my left. I take the push stick with my right. I place the push stick just to the left of the center line of the workpiece and point it slightly towards the fence. When I have control of the workpiece with the push stick, I can grab the table saw with my left so I won't fall over no matter what. And then I follow all the way through. All the way through. One nice smooth motion. To get the offcut away from the blade, I reach behind the splitter with the push stick and just shove gently. It's all one smooth motion. Okay, to recover your workpiece, once the saw is shut down or while it's still running, you never want to reach over the blade like this to recover your workpiece or your scrap. You'd always want to come around to the side of the saw and take it from behind. Okay? You're always feeding the work into the saw. You're never pulling it through the saw. If you have a helper on the other end of your workpiece, your helper is never pulling on it. All they're doing is supporting it. If you have a helper on the other end of the board behind you, they're never pushing, they're never steering, they're just supporting the weight of the workpiece. The operator of the saw is the only one that steers the workpiece. So again, I'm going to walk you through without turning the saw on so you can hear a little bit better, and I'm going to use the same piece that I just worked on so that we can get through the saw. Okay? So I've got my workpiece, it's nowhere near the blade, the floor is clear, I'm clear behind. I reach down and I turn the saw on. I make sure my push stick is there. I take my workpiece, get full control of it. My knees are slightly bent, up against the fence, down against the table. I walk towards the saw. I don't shuffle, I walk. When my left hand reaches the table, the heel of my left hand goes down on the table. My index finger and thumb walk along the top left-hand corner of the workpiece. My right hand feeds. When my right fingers touch the back of the table saw fence, I hold with my left. I go for the push stick just to the left of the center line of the workpiece and pointed slightly towards the fence. Grab the table with my left hand and feed all the way through in one nice smooth motion. Okay? All the way through. The scrap comes away. I put my push stick down and I kick the saw off. I told you I was going to show you how to cut a longer piece of wood safely. We've got a piece of wood here that's about 10 feet long and 12 inches wide. It is a piece that's easily handled by one person if they know what they're doing. Once in a while you're going to want some support behind you, whether that's a helper or another sawhorse, but most of the time you can handle stuff like this on your own. So I've set the height of the blade, I've set my desired width of cut. I make sure there's nothing on the floor I can trip on, and I make sure that there's nobody behind me in case I get a kickback. I'm going to turn the saw on, and we're going to rip a 3-inch piece off this board. I pick the board up at the balance point so I've got full control of it. I don't want to be back at the end of it. I don't want to be at the forward end of it. I want to be able to balance the board where I'm at holding it. I'm up against the fence, down against the table, and I start to walk towards the saw. Now you notice I'm walking, I'm not shuffling. When my hip contacts the saw, I can lean against the saw. I'll hold with my left, I re-grip with my right. You notice my left hand, the thumb and the index finger are just walking the edge. Hold, push stick, grab, follow all the way through. Go ahead and let the piece drop if you have to. Turn the saw off. Get your scrap out of the way. What we're going to be doing now is cutting some little bit oddly shaped pieces of wood. I want to show you what you can do with the table saw and maybe some of the things you shouldn't be attempting. Now the table saw is designed primarily for ripping, as I told you before. It's down the length of the grain. One thing that we don't want to attempt doing is cross-cutting on the table saw unless we're set up for it. Now this setup right here, set up for ripping, it's not a cross-cutting operation. For instance, I've got the fence set for 3 inches. I don't want to try and cut 3 inches off the end of a board like this with the table saw. And here's why. Is that the primary use for the fence is maintaining a relationship between the fence and the blade. The blade and the fence are completely parallel. If your cut is not completely parallel or your workpiece does not rest totally up against the fence, you're going to get in some trouble because you can get a kickback, and I'll tell you what a kickback is in a minute, okay? If I tried to cross-cut this piece of wood like this, the lever arm or the length of the wood out here, it's wider than it is long. I'm going to have a tendency to control the outer edge of this piece of wood more than I can control this. If I tried to pass this over that blade, even with a push stick, there's no way that I could steer that piece of wood through there. So, whenever we have anything that's less than 12 inches wide, we can always cross-cut on the chop saw, and that's a different tool in a different video. So, you could conceivably make a cross-cut with your miter fence, okay? The miter fence fits in a slot and slides along like this. You could mark your piece for the length you wanted, and then you could make your cross-cut here. But you don't want that fence anywhere near the end of the piece. So like I say, we're designed primarily for ripping here. Now say you have a piece of wood you want to cut a strip off of, or you want to rip a strip off of, and it's got an oddly shaped end. One of the things you want to avoid is having to push on that oddly shaped end. Even with your push stick, if it's not square or 90 degrees to the fence, you're going to have a tendency to steer the board away from the fence or the back end away from the fence, which can set you up for a kickback. Okay? So if you have an oddly shaped piece like this, always make sure that you have a square edge that you can feed with your push stick. Okay? Here's an extreme example. If I wanted to cut a strip off the edge of this piece of wood right here, I certainly wouldn't want to feed it in the saw like this, okay? Yeah, there's something to hang on to here, but if I get a kickback, it's going to slide through my hand. I'm going to get all kinds of splinters. Plus, when I get most of the way through the cut, there's no place for the push stick to go. So I could conceivably feed this piece in pointy end first, and then I can hook with the push stick. So we're going to do that real quick. Okay. I got to set my depth, set my width, make sure the floor is clear, make sure nobody's behind me, turn the saw on. Now my hip's already up against the fence. This is a short work piece. I've got total control of it. One smooth motion. You always come around the back of the saw to recover your workpiece. Okay, what else do we have? Okay, here's a piece that could give you a little bit of trouble. This is at least as wide as it is long. If I tried to cut this piece in the table saw, I might be setting myself up. Okay? It's usually better to take a small piece out of a longer piece that you've already ripped to width. So if you do have a small piece like this, and say you want to cut a little tiny piece off of it, we're going to set the fence for, say, an inch. Make sure I've got my cut. Okay? Make sure I don't have too much projection. The more projection you got with the blade coming above the workpiece, the more possibility you have of cutting a finger totally off or a hand totally off. So I get the workpiece out of the way. Now it's all push stick. You never reach for your scrap or your workpiece with your bare hands when you're anywhere near the blade. Always reach around the blade. Okay, so say we had to slice a really thin piece off the edge of this for some maybe edge banding. We want to be able to do that safely. We still want to be able to use a push stick, okay? But if we're so tight to the blade here, the splitter is going to get in the way, so we're going to have to take the splitter off. So before I reach my hand down inside below the throat plate, I'm going to want to have the saw unplugged. Okay, now I've got the saw unplugged. I can reach in here safely and get the splitter out. And when you actually come out in the shop for your tool orientation, I'll show you how all this stuff works. Because I'm going to be ripping thin bands off the edge of a piece of wood, I'm going to put a zero clearance throat plate in there so the pieces can't fall down in beside the blade. I got to make sure the throat plate is flush with the table. Get any metal objects or anything else out of the way. Okay. Set the width of my cut, and in this case I want to cut maybe 1/8 of an inch off this. I set it to my gauge. I measure to make sure I've got the width I want. I lock the fence down. I make sure that my workpiece has got a completely straight edge. If it doesn't, it's got to go over to the joiner and get a straight edge jointed on it. Okay? I can tell it's straight by putting it up against the fence, and I can't see any dark lines or gaps. So I got to set the correct depth. Okay? Maybe I only need about 1/8 of an inch of clearance there. Make sure nobody's behind me. Nothing's on the floor. Now here's something you got to watch out for, is this push stick's been used for exactly this operation, and there's just a little frayed edge on the heel. So I want something that I can push against this strip with. So I'll take one of my other push sticks, and it's got just about 1/8 of an inch to push these strips through. Now this is all push stick again too. Tight up against the fence. Follow all the way through. Eighth-inch rip. So that's how you use the table saw for ripping very thin pieces off. That way you can make bent laminations if you want. So if you want to glue a couple of pieces together in a curve You make a jig, put some glue between them, and then when it dries, you got a shape. Most plywood comes in 4x8 sheets, so it's a little unwieldy for one person to handle the cut. You always want to, when you're ripping a sheet of plywood, you always want to rip the biggest piece off that you can initially, so that you've got full control of the piece that's running against the fence. If I just needed a 3-inch piece of this plywood, I'd probably rip it down the middle first and then take that 2-foot wide sheet and then rip my 3 inches off of it. So I've set the saw for 24 inches. I'm going to turn the saw on. I've made sure the floor is clear. I made sure nobody's walking behind me, and Quinn's standing by to give me a hand. Okay, Quinn. So, keep it away from the blade. We walk back. Quinn's got control of the forward end. I've got control of the back. Up against the fence. That's what I'm watching. I always want to steer against the fence. Start making the cut. Okay, now as I approach the saw, I move to the left of the line of fire. I don't want to be in the way. Okay, I hold here. Now I've got enough room here. I don't have to use the push stick, but I'm keeping my hand well to the left of the blade and pushing against the fence. And I don't have to push the outside piece because it's still hooked here. And I follow all the way through. Now you notice I'm still trying to keep away from that blade, and I've still got a grip on the table, so if I do fall over, I'm not going into that blade, and I'm following all the way through. I could stand here and push this sheet through like this, but I'm going to have a tendency to steer it away from the fence, and that's when it pinches the back of the blade. It catches that blade coming in this direction, and then you get a kickback. Okay? So to avoid that kickback, whether it's solid timber or plywood, you always want to make sure that work is being pushed up against the fence no matter what you do.